This is Nightly Business Report with Bill Griffith and Sue Herrera.
Policy pivot. This time it happened in Europe, and that got investors here nervous, pushing stocks lower for the fourth straight session.
Fraud crackdown. The Justice Department charges hundreds of individuals for victimizing millions of older Americans in the largest elder fraud bust ever.
Tax law typo. It's an expensive mistake for some small business owners who are now paying the price. Those stories and more tonight on Nightly Business Report for Thursday, March 7th.
And we do bid you a good evening, everybody, and welcome. A storm cloud hung over Wall Street today. Stocks fell on more evidence that economies around the globe are slowing down. And today it was Europe that was at the center of that storm after the European Central Bank cut its outlook for the year and announced a new round of stimulus. And while Europe may seem far away when it comes to economic and profit growth, it's not. As we have seen repeatedly, a hiccup overseas can affect our economy as well, whether it's through trade and tariff issues or through U.S.-based corporations that do business overseas. At the close, the Dow Industrial Average was down 200 points today to 25,473. The Nasdaq fell by 84. The S&P slipped by 22. Bob Pisani has more on today's market decline.
Stocks drifted lower throughout the day with global growth fears once again the top of mind for investors. Now, don't underestimate the power of central banks. We had a policy pivot from the Federal Reserve in December. It got more dovish. And now we have the European Central Bank pivot. They're getting more dovish. ECB chief Mario Draghi leaving rates unchanged, slashing growth prospects for Europe, and launching another lending program to offer cheap money to banks over in Europe.
The persistence of uncertainties related to geopolitical factors, the threat of protectionism, and vulnerabilities in emerging markets appears to be leaving marks on economic sentiment.
And lately, the markets appear to be stalling out. So there's the usual hand-wringing over the fact that after a 17% rally from the December low, sector leaders are meeting a certain amount of resistance in the last few weeks. And it's true. Leadership groups like the semiconductor stocks, small cap companies, the banks and the industrials, they've all been weak lately because the markets are not really cheap anymore, and they were the market leaders. They're the ones that moved up the most. The key now is to stop the decline in earnings estimates, and there are signs that that is starting to happen. So the first quarter earnings growth estimates, they've stabilized around down 1%. Still negative, but if this keeps up, earnings could be positive for the first quarter because they're usually revised upward. That's the key thing. That will push this number into positive territory, and that means likely we'll see no earnings recession, at least not starting in the first quarter. Investors have gotten used to the idea of an endless up spiral, but maybe it's time to temper that up indication. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Bob Pisani at the New York Stock Exchange.
A Federal Reserve governor said both global and domestic economic growth is softening. Lael Brainerd added that the weakening means the central bank should slow its pace of interest rate increases, adding to the chorus of Fed officials who are now rethinking monetary policy.
While our economy continues to add jobs at a solid pace, demand appears to have softened against a backdrop of downside risks. Prudence counsels a policy of watchful waiting, especially with no signs that inflation is picking up.
Brainerd cited trade and Brexit for her outlook. She has a permanent vote on the Fed's rate-setting arm.
Well, a new report out today showed that worker productivity grew at a nearly 2% annual rate in the fourth quarter. That registered its strongest growth rate over a 9-month period since 2010. Worker productivity gains, in theory, create a backdrop for rising wages, corporate profits, or both. Separately, another report showed that household net worth saw its biggest decline since the financial crisis. According to the Federal Reserve, our total net worth dropped by $3.7 trillion to about $104 trillion at the end of the fourth quarter. Much of that is being attributed to that steep stock market decline we saw at the end of last year.
And it is that household wealth that scammers are after. The Justice Department today announced the largest ever nationwide crackdown on elder fraud schemes so aggressive that even a former CIA director was targeted. Andrea Day has the details.
The sweep this year involves charges against more than 260 defendants who allegedly defrauded more than 2 million Americans of more than $750 million.
The numbers are staggering, with more seniors being targeted now than ever before. Criminals, in some cases, duping the elderly out of their life savings. Attorney General William Barr calling the fraud massive and despicable.
We have to prosecute an all-out attack on this kind of crime.
But investigators say con men picked the wrong guy when they targeted 95-year-old Bill Webster, a former CIA and FBI director, telling him he just won millions of dollars in a lottery. The catch? He'd have to send in $50,000 to cover the taxes.
I feel so sorry for older people who get this good news of the money they've won, and they are going to be terribly disappointed.
He says the caller was relentless, threatening to kill his wife, even after learning who Bill was. The couple played along with the scheme, and the man behind it was ultimately taken down.
Our message, and the reason we're here today, is that anyone, absolutely anybody, can be targeted by the scammers, many of whom seem legitimate, friendly, like your next-door neighbor. Our message is don't be fooled.
And investigators say the callers are very creative and always looking for new ways to dupe the elderly. The most common is a tech support fraud based in India. Now that's where callers will say your computer's been hacked and they'll fix it free of charge if given access to your computer. I'm Andrea Day for Nightly Business Report.
So why has elder financial abuse become so widespread, and what can you do to protect yourself? Joining us tonight is Jean Setzfan, Senior Vice President of Financial Security at AARP. Jean, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Boy, this is widespread. I mean, how do... I have to think that scammers wouldn't do this if it didn't work. Why does it work so effectively?
Well, there's a portion of the older American generation that are very trusting, quite frankly, and they feel bad for not picking up their phones. And once you have somebody on the phone, you're more likely than not to actually listen to them and fall prey to what they're selling you.
I assume you're encouraged by today's action, but it seems from everything we're hearing, it's really only the tip of the iceberg. Can you put it in perspective for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, we are very encouraged by the fact that some scammers have been and fraudsters have been caught. I mean, you hear too much about frauds and never sort of hear the good news of the bad actors being caught. So there is an ongoing trend around the tech support scam, definitely tracked by the FTC. We have a fraud helpline, and that tracks very similarly. We're getting a lot more calls about this issue. So broadly speaking, this is really a devastating fraud that's really hurting a lot of people, especially older Americans.
And it would seem that education could get rid of this, or at least help to keep people from answering the phone and going along with some of these scams. Now, you mentioned the hotline. What else can be done, do you think, to educate these elders about what the possibilities are for these scams?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, a Microsoft or an Apple, all the reputable sort of technology firms would never call you out of the blue. So if you actually get a call from them and they're saying that they're sort of Microsoft here to help you because they've detected a virus on your computer, hang the phone up. It's 100% a scam.
Same with the IRS too, right?
Same with the IRS. There's a lot of imposters trying to pretend to be somebody they're not. So none of these organizations, either governmental or large companies, ever call you out of the blue for no good reason.
You know, it points out, does it not, that technology and the advancement of technology and how it's integrated into our lives in so many different ways. Some people are not as comfortable with technology as others are. So when something pops up on their phone or their computer, they're not as well equipped to maybe realize that that's a scam.
Absolutely. Whether you're tech savvy or not, the fraudsters are really good. I myself got an email the other day that actually talked about downloads that my kids were doing. I thought they actually did it, but in fact, it was not real. So be very careful. If you get any emails with links, never open them, especially from people you don't know. So the best thing to do, quite frankly, is don't answer the phone from anybody that you don't know. Don't respond to an email with anybody that you don't know. If there's a pop-up on your screen that actually has you call a number, None of the programs actually work that way. Do not call that number.
Jean Setzfan with AARP. Words of wisdom there. Thank you for joining us again tonight. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
You bet.
Bye-bye.
Equifax and Marriott were victims of 2 major data breaches. And today, executives from those companies appeared in front of lawmakers who are working to address the problem with new regulations. Kayla Tausche is in Washington tonight.
Executives from Marriott and Equifax took their apology tour to Capitol Hill after suffering 2 of the biggest customer data breaches in U.S. history.
We deeply regret this incident and are committed to determining how it occurred, supporting our affected guests, and enhancing security measures to protect against future attacks.
Marriott CEO Arne Sorensen said the company inherited the security issues when the company bought Starwood Hotels. Over 4 years, hackers took information from 383 million Starwood customers and 5 million passports. U.S. officials have said China conducted the hack.
We have shared everything we have with the FBI, including the addresses used and the malware tools used in the system so that they can do that kind of investigation. We've simply been focused on making sure the door is closed.
At credit reporting company Equifax, a 2017 breach subjected 143 million customers to potential bank and identity fraud. Senator Tom Carper, the top Democrat on the committee that hosted the executives, blamed the company.
Information obtained by this subcommittee and included in a bipartisan report released last night illustrates a years-long neglect of basic cybersecurity practices.
With cyber attacks becoming a regular occurrence, lawmakers are shifting from trying to stop them to setting expectations for how to deal with them, like when customers should be notified and whether companies should be able to make money off their vulnerability. Equifax CEO Mark Begor touted the company's free products for victims.
When the breach happened, we offered a free credit monitoring product to any American.
As lawmakers eye new federal regulations, Ted Rossman of creditcards.com says consumers can take their own measures.
We can't protect ourselves against everything, but by freezing our credit and by checking in on our finances regularly, even if we can't totally prevent it all, we're going to know early enough that it's going to make it easier to unwind.
While fewer people are falling victim to identity fraud than in years past, the cost for those who do is going up. According to Javelin Research, that out-of-pocket cost hit $1.7 billion last year. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Kayla Tausche in Washington.
Time to take a look at some of today's upgrades and downgrades. We begin with shares of Toll Brothers, which were downgraded to underweight from neutral at J.P. Morgan. The analyst calls Toll's fundamental outlook below average. Price target now $32, but despite that downgrade, the stock rose nearly 2% today at $35.51. AB InBev was downgraded to sector perform from a top pick at RBC Capital. The analyst says that the company has little prospect for margin growth right now. The firm also cited the stock's valuation, and that stock did fall 2% today to $80.36.
Pepsi was initiated with an underperform rating at Credit Suisse. The analyst there cites an increase in competition and its struggling beverage business. The price target is 100. The stock fell a fraction to 116.10. Estee Lauder was upgraded to overweight from neutral at J.P. Morgan. The analyst cites confidence that its earnings goals are achievable. The price target is $175. The stock rose about 1% to $155.40.
Still ahead, the impact of steel and aluminum tariffs 1 year later.
It has been a rough ride for the transportation sector. The Dow Transportation Index has fallen for 10 straight sessions, making this its longest losing streak since early 2009. And while airline stocks only make up a part of that index, they've also hit some turbulence recently. Phil LeBeau spoke to a number of airline CEOs today in Washington.
Despite airline stocks flying considerably lower over the last week as investors worry about the possibility of a recession hurting business, the CEOs of several major airlines say they still see strong demand, especially here in the United States.
Pretty much for the half a year, we're feeling pretty strong, and we're not seeing any significant slowdown at this point.
Air travel is strong globally and domestically. Everything we see, our visibility is not the greatest. People book 30 days in advance, but continues to be very strong.
A lot of our business is originating on the west coast of the United States, and the markets that we're operating in, we're seeing quite solid demand.
The next big test for airline stocks, what happens in the spring and summer travel seasons, two of the busiest times of the year for the airlines. Those results will be critical to seeing if these stocks can perhaps build a base and then start to move higher over the next several months. Phil LeBeau, Nightly Business Report, Washington, D.C.
A food fight at Kroger, and that's where we begin tonight's market focus. The supermarket chain reported a drop in profit and said it expects earnings for the whole year to come in below expectations. The company has spent billions of dollars to overhaul its stores and to improve online sales in order to better compete with Walmart and Amazon. And its CFO says its investments will pay off.
With our launch of Kroger Ship, that we made some investments in the fourth quarter, which was part of the margin erosion we saw in the fourth quarter, we would expect to be able to serve 100% of the United States by this time next year.
Nonetheless, Kroger shares fell 10% today to $25.61. Elsewhere, General Electric gave investors an update today on its insurance business. The company said that current reserves for its long-term care policies are sufficient and that it's looking to increase premiums. GE also said that it's on course to raise about $9 billion by 2024 to cover the cost of those long-term care policies that were written about a decade ago. The stock rose more than 3.5% today to $9.45. Online marketplace Etsy gave investors a 5-year growth target that was in line with Wall Street expectations. Etsy also said that it sees global merchandise sales growing at a compound rate of 16 to 20% annually, with revenue growth slightly faster. But investors were expecting more, and shares fell 4% today to $67.24. And H&R Block's quarterly revenue topped expectations as its do-it-yourself tax returns offset a drop in assisted returns. The income tax filing company's full-year outlook was in line with Wall Street estimates, and shares rose more than 2.5% today to $24.16.
International Game Technology missed on earnings, but revenue was in line with forecasts. The company's 2018 results were also in line with the outlook that it provided back in October. The gaming company, which makes slot machines, has seen shares nosedive more than 45% over the past year. Today, they fell nearly 16% to $14.35. Barnes & Noble beat on earnings but posted flat sales for the holiday season. The bookseller also warned investors its full-year earnings will be weaker than previously estimated. Shares fell nearly 13% to $5.11. Costco reported better than expected quarterly profit thanks to an increase in online sales. The warehouse club operator improved its website, which helped attract more shoppers, as did same-day delivery for groceries. But total revenue was just shy of estimates. Didn't bother investors, though. They sent the stock up in initial after-hours trading. Shares finished the regular session down 1% to $216.79. Online ticketing company Eventbrite reported a wider-than-expected loss and issued weak first-quarter guidance. Paid ticket sales grew, as did net revenue, but that wasn't enough to offset the lousy outlook, and that sent the stock sharply lower in initial after-hours trading. It rose 3% to $32.42 in the regular session.
It has now been 1 year since President Trump enacted those tariffs on imported steel and aluminum, and the results have been mixed. I mean, while some domestic producers do credit the levies with reviving a struggling industry, others say the tariffs have had a negative impact, resulting in higher prices on some everyday items. Frank Holland takes stock now of this part of the trade war 1 year later.
We're urging all companies to buy American.
That was President Trump's goal when he imposed steel and aluminum tariffs last March. And it seems to be working. Aluminum production in the U.S. is expected to increase by 60% this year, compared to 2017 before the tariffs. And there's more room for growth. Domestic supply is only meeting about 20% of U.S. demand. Michael Bless, CEO of Century Aluminum, says the 10% tariff on aluminum makes U.S. companies more competitive against foreign producers, that sell at lower prices because they get government subsidies.
The U.S. should be able to produce some, a vast minority in aluminum, but some of its own primary aluminum, 1.2 million out of 5.7 million tons here. Then the tariffs were the only way to right the playing field right now.
Bless says since the tariffs took effect, Century Aluminum has increased production by 250% and increased workers by 25%. But last quarter, the company reported a loss, the result of a sharp rise in raw material costs.
The price of alumina doubles and our profits crater, and so it's a temporary condition.
Last year, Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross famously dismissed any price increases as minimal.
Here's a can of Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola has 3 cents worth of aluminum in it. So if that goes up 10%, that's 0.3 of a cent. I just paid $1.49 for this can of Coke. It doesn't mean anything. So all this hysteria is a lot to do about nothing.
But Coke ended up passing those higher costs on to consumers.
We had to take, with our bottling partners, an increase on our sparkling beverage industry in the middle of the year, which is relatively uncommon. And that's the freight, that's the metals, the steel, the aluminum going up, the labor going up.
As trade talks between the U.S. and China continue, steel and aluminum producers are watching the growing debate over tariffs that are growing their business. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Frank Holland.
Coming up, a small typo in the tax law and a big headache for one industry. Huawei is suing the U.S. The Chinese telecom company contends that Congress violated the Constitution when it banned government agencies from purchasing Huawei equipment. The U.S. government has alleged that Huawei is closely aligned with the Chinese government and that its equipment could be used as a spying tool. Huawei has denied those allegations.
We have certainly been telling you about some tax filing surprises under the new tax law this year. And here's another one. The legislation was supposed to allow businesses to write off construction costs in the very first year. But one industry accidentally got left out. Yolan Mui explains.
Looks like we're ready for lunch. Matt Harridge thought he was going to get a big break under the new tax law. He owns this Burger King franchise in West Virginia and planned to expand with 2 new locations. Now, that's on hold because of a typo in the tax code. This is an error, and that's the frustrating part about this. Under the new law, restaurants don't qualify for the immediate write-off that other businesses get for construction. Instead, they have to write it off over 39 years. That's even longer than the 15-year schedule they had before the new law. In other words, Harridge is worse off than he was before. We do not have any certainty that we will get to depreciate at that 15-year rate or at that bonus rate. And so we really can't count on that. And so we are slowing down our rate of remodel and new builds. That's the exact opposite of what Congress intended.
It's just a legislative language mistake that needs to be corrected.
That correction is in the works here in Washington, but it needs support from Republicans and Democrats.
This is a 15-minute fix. Let's do it. Let's get on, and let's not play partisan games with something that affects jobs in every single member's district.
There is hope that a fix could pass later on this year as part of a big government spending package, but nothing is guaranteed here on Capitol Hill. So for now, business owners like Matt Harridge remain in limbo. For Nightly Business Report, I'm Yolan Mui in Washington.
And that is Nightly Business Report for tonight. I'm Sue Herrera. Thanks for watching. We'd like to remind you that this is the time of year your public television station seeks your support.
And I'm Bill Griffith. Thank you very much for that support. Have a great evening. We'll see you tomorrow.